Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Cory Hughes. Last name is spelled Hughes. He's been on my show before. We did an episode I titled The Two Oswalds, and it was one of my most listened to shows that people watch it with or listen to it with great interest. Deservedly, because he's done just excellent research into the JFK assassination. Today is October 2nd, so we're coming on to the 60-year anniversary here of this very important event. Changed history, changed world history, changed American history, changed the cultural history. But he's just published a new book. Full title is A Warning from History. And you can see it if you're watching this on YouTube or Rockfin or Rumble. You can see the cover, obviously the grassy knoll and some dark characters overseeing this whole event. But he has published this with Chris Matthew. I've been on his show, Forbidden Knowledge News. And he's gone through just tons of documents. I mean, he said he's read just an incredible amount of information. It's reflected in the book. And so we're just going to go into that. So, Cory Hughes, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I really appreciate your having me on. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So for people who may not have heard our earlier interview, can you kind of talk about your background, how you got interested in JFK? I know you've been researching it for a long time and then just putting together this book, A Warning from History.
Sure. So, of course, like everyone else, my interest in Kennedy started with the Kennedy movie, JFK, by Oliver Stone. I do not hold that film to any factual account. It's a very entertaining piece of propaganda. But after that, I kind of had always, kind of kept up with what I considered to be the official conspiracy theory, right? Kennedy was killed by the CIA, blah, 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 all that stuff over Vietnam, and so I became a cop back in 2005, and I was a cop for about 8.5 years. And when I got out of police work, I felt that I had a skill set that I could apply to the Kennedy assassination. So I did, and I spent basically the last 5 years, this has been the focus of my life. I started in July of 2018 with the documents, and the first thing I did was I made the decision to avoid books at all costs. I didn't want to be swayed by anyone's opinion. I got right into the documents directly, and that helped me really kind of come to what I believe is the conclusion of this incredible story.
And there's so many actors involved. Like, you really go into people that I wouldn't know, like, were associated with this. We talked about Valenti last time. Very important cultural figure, ended up going to Los Angeles and kind of managing the film industry there, overseeing it. And
well, one thing I think it's kind of telling is that he ran Hollywood from DC. His office was in DC. It was never in Hollywood. And so when you get into Jack Valenti, you come to find out that guy worked for the CIA his whole life, right? There's even a document in his file that conclusively states this, that he had to have his payroll transferred from another federal agency onto the White House payroll when he got hired on November 22nd, 1963. Where he went to work for Johnson directly. In my opinion, he was Johnson's handler in the White House. But Jack Valenti, most certainly the most important person in American history that no one ever talks about or even realizes. If you were absorbed anything out of Hollywood between 1966 and 2004, if Hollywood helped shape your perception of the world during those years, you were a victim of Jack Valenti and his propaganda through the Motion Picture Association of America. So yes, he has most certainly shaped the lives of all of us here without almost any of us knowing it.
It's incredible. I'm so old. I remember watching TV in the major channels. And I can't remember which award show, but he used to come out at the beginning, like the boss. Like, we're going to have Jack Valenti, and he'd get up and say something, and then they'd go on and do the award show. Like, it was incredible how much power. And we went through last time, we went through those amazing pictures that you had of him on the day of the assassination, sitting at the table, looking totally exhausted, also driving the car. And I think you have chapters in this book about, like, the escape from Dealey.
Right.
I mean, it's just incredible history that I've had, like, I think you'll be like my 18th interview on the JFK assassination from varying different.
Well, he makes me really, he makes you think of, do you remember Chuck Barris from, what was it, The Gong Show, who claimed to be a CIA assassin? I believe him. Right. So when I came to understand who Jack Valenti was, it made the statements by Chuck Barris that he was a CIA assassin much more plausible. Although there's really no information on Chuck. I've tried looking. There's really nothing out there on him. But yes.
There was that movie, right? Wasn't there a movie with...
Confessions of a Dangerous Mind.
Yeah. Confessions of a Dangerous Mind.
But Hollywood is not what people think. It is definitely a tool of the CIA. Initially, really controlled by Lou Wasserman, handed off to Jack Valenti, and now you've got Glickman is running the MPAA. I've never looked into him. I promise you, he works for the CIA. I'll have to do some in-depth digging into his background one day. But
I mean, that's the thing about this whole event, assassination. Everybody has some kind of intel spook connection if they're not in it themselves, right?
Everybody. Everybody. All of Kennedy's guys were basically CIA. Marty Underwood and Moyers, Bill Moyers, like all these guys were working with the CIA, right? The CIA pretty much owned everybody. It seems like after World War II, between 45 and 47, allegedly there's no intelligence community, but really that was the most important 2 years in forming the CIA ever. And in 47, it seems like they just went out and got anybody they could in any industry, especially if you worked in publishing, if you worked in any kind of media, they just ate you up right away. I recently had a long conversation with Johnny Vedmore, who's done a lot of studying into Ms. Magazine, which was founded by Gloria Steinem and a woman named Elizabeth Forsling Harris. Harris, I talk about in the book, she 35 years after the assassination, tries to retroactively give Jack Valenti an alibi. And it fails miserably because I debunk her alibi just based on the statements of the people she claimed to have been with during the time of the motorcade. Elizabeth Forsling Harris was the working for Sam Bloom at Sam Bloom's advertising agency. She was the point of contact for Kenny O'Donnell to Sam Bloom's office, who Sam Bloom was on the board of the Dallas Citizens Council, and Kenny O'Donnell was in direct contact with him via Elizabeth Forsling Harris to establish the motorcade, right? So Elizabeth Forsling Harris, clearly CIA, retroactively, like I said, in 1988, tries to give an alibi to Jack Valenti, whose alibi involved, because for the audience, if I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, Jack Valenti was the shooter on the grassy knoll, the quintessential shooter on the grassy knoll who took off Kennedy's head in frame 313 of the Zapruder film. In order to understand that, you have to understand a complex background of Valenti, which involves his mob background, his CIA background, and I believe his involvement in other assassinations throughout history. But Elizabeth Forsling Harris, I think, is such a fascinating person because she clearly, besides her intelligence connections, the connection to Sam Bloom and her being the connection between Kenny O'Donnell makes her an absolutely key person in the plotting of the assassination, and at least as far as the coordination of the motorcade goes. And the coordination of the motorcade, which fell to the Dallas Citizens Council to handle, was quite controversial because initially it was not supposed to go through Dealey Plaza. It was supposed to go to the Women's Building, is what it was called. But the Women's Building would have, that route in particular would have bypassed Dealey Plaza. And at this point in late October, you have allegedly Oswald supposed to have been working at the Texas School Book Depository by now. So the story had already been started to formulate in October, and changing the location to the Women's Building would have wrecked everything. So Sam Bloom threw a personal fit over this and got the motorcade to stay en route to the Trade Mart, which was another CIA building owned and operated by a company called Permindex, which also was connected to the Trade Mart in New Orleans that Clay Shaw worked with. But Permindex was ultimately a Mossad front company that had Alan Dulles, James Angleton, all kinds of mafioso like Joe Bonanno, Mo Dalitz, also guys like Trump's lawyer in the 1980s, Roy Cohn, all sat on the board of Permindex, So Permindex was a Mossad front company that organized it was like the oversight board, is from what I can tell, in reference to the assassination, the large-scale planning, right? And from there, the money got funneled through a company in a sub-company called Centre Mondial Commercial, which was run by a guy named Louis Bloomfield out of Montreal. And then we have easily provable connections between Louis Bloomfield in Montreal to Clay Shaw down in New Orleans. And ultimately, Clay Shaw will end up being in New Orleans on November 22nd with a guy named Erwin Heyman, who was a representative of the Jewish agency in Switzerland, who was in Dallas on that day. So I kind of got off a little track here, but that kind of happens often.
The connections are incredible because Clay Shaw was just supposed to be, a simple businessman. There's all videos of him, but he's fully connected.
Fully connected. That guy is so ruthless. It's unbelievable. Yeah. When you come to understand his connections to like the ADL and through the Schlumberger Corporation and his relationship with the Stern family, right? Like the banking, the banking clan, Stern family, who basically they paid for his entire defense, right? So the Stern family paid for Clay Shaw's defense. This was actually discovered by Michael Collins Piper in his book Final Judgment, which is like the first book anyone should ever read on the assassination. But yeah,
And Schlumberger or whatever Schlumberger is just a huge multinational
right. So
mining billions of dollars. Like they're
right.
around this whole event. Like
So
these super rich.
Schlumberger was run by a guy named Jean de Menil. Jean de Menil sat on the board of directors of this Permindex, this Mossad front company. He lived in Houston. He was like a big socialite, and to this very day, the Menil gallery still hosts it's a huge art gallery in Houston. So very influential guy, and he happened to own the Schlumberger arms depot in Houma, Louisiana, that the CIA was using to store surplus weapons, right? So all the World War II surplus gets back to America and it gets stuck into these depots around the country. Well, starting in 1945, as soon as the war was over, David Ben-Gurion, along with a guy named Rudolf Sonborn, formed what's called the Sonborn Institute, which really was a front organization as a cover for this large-scale smuggling operation that involved breaking into these depots and arms depots around the country, stealing all the arms, and then shipping them back to Israel. Now, we've all heard about the Houma, Louisiana depot that David Ferry, Sergei Arcacha, Gordon Novell, and Leighton Martins allegedly broke into in 1962. Well, they did do that, and the story was that all those arms and the weapons were supposed to be going to the Cubans to fight Castro, right, to overthrow Castro. But that's a lie. All those arms and weapons got sold to a company in Virginia called Interarmco, which was another company run by Samuel Cummings, a very well-known CIA agent in the arms trade, who also was connected to a guy named Enrico Frattoli, who sat on the board of Permindex. So all the weapons that were supposed to go to the anti-Castro Cubans and all the arms that were supposed to go to the anti-Castro Cubans, they never did. They got deflected to Israel so they could fight the Palestinians. So at the Bay of Pigs, when people wonder why it failed because they didn't have, on the ground, there was no arms and there was no money, there was no infantry that could handle taking on Castro, because all of that support went to Israel. And so that's one of the aspects of the assassination no one ever talks about. People still have this myth that the assassination was about Castro and some other things, and no, the Cubans are so irrelevant in the Kennedy assassination, it's unbelievable. Nobody gave a shit about the Cubans. All that stuff was a front. All the Cuban organizations that were being run, especially the ones that were being run out of 544 Camp Street at Guy Bannister's office, those were CIA fronts for raising and laundering money. That's it. Those guys didn't care about the Cubans whatsoever. Sergio Arcacha actually got fired from the FRD, the Frente Revolucionario Democrático, which was one of the Cuban organizations, because he stole all the money, right? So these guys didn't care about Cuba one bit. So anytime you hear Kennedy researchers talk about the Cubans, the anti-Castro Cubans, it's a distraction. It's completely irrelevant to the story.
But aren't they around? Wasn't there Mongoose and all those other people, and that the real Reed, the JFK sealed his fate by blowing the Bay of Pigs invasion? Because Ferry was pissed off about it, right?
Ferry was real pissed off about that. But the Bay of Pigs invasion, I've read some conflicting things about the Bay of Pigs, and it seems like it was almost sabotaged intentionally by the CIA as it was going on. It almost feels like it was some kind of red herring. I haven't spent enough time on it to be able to give you anything definitive here, but my BS detector is going off big time when I look at the official stories of what happened at the Bay of Pigs. Supposedly it didn't succeed because Kennedy didn't send air support. Well, that's kind of a misnomer, because the CIA sent air support. They had their own pilots like David Ferry, who were involved with the invasion, right? So it was that they didn't have weapons on the ground. They didn't have the ground support. That was the problem. But as far as the motivations, I don't know. But I can tell you with certainty, after the Bay of Pigs, Cuba was still being used as a jump-off point for smuggling operations. To me, the idea that Cuba would still be used for smuggling operations under the nose of Castro without him knowing about it doesn't ring true to me whatsoever. And the idea that we spent 50 years trying to knock off this dictator on a dinky island 90 miles off the coast unsuccessfully just reeks of utter BS. I believe the whole thing was a front. I believe he was a smuggling partner with the CIA his entire life. I don't think we are ever trying to... all the stories about trying to put hits out on Castro, I think are complete cover stories to distract from something else. What that something else is, I don't know, but...
If you look at the Americans' imperial foreign invasions after World War II, they were successful everywhere else. Chile, Iran, Iraq. We can just go down the list of how many... Libya, right? So why couldn't they just do this rinky-dink island,
right,
that is 90 miles away from our shore? It wouldn't take that much. So you're right. There's something suspicious about the whole Cuban. Maybe they just got burnt out by the Cuban Missile Crisis or something. Or it is odd. The Cuban military is doesn't. I mean, it's nothing like the U.S. The U.S.
Right.
is like a giant, a Goliath to a gnat. I mean, it's
Right. It
something
just
else.
makes me feel like the whole thing was a sham.
Yeah,
You
it's
know, and
weird.
like it,
Honduras, we subverted almost every major country's like elections, but they couldn't do Cuba. It's weird.
and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Castro came out and said that he was like a CIA agent his whole life. I mean, like, I don't know, man, but like the whole thing is just fishy. And so
For
when it
sure.
comes to Castro and communism, this is another thing that I highlight in the book is that the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which is allegedly the proof that Oswald was a communist, that was a front organization by the CIA from day one. The obfuscation of their history, trying to blame it on a guy named Vincent T. Lee, out of Tampa, is more distraction. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee was actually founded by Richard Gibson and Robert Tabor, who were working with CBS and were both most certainly CIA. Richard Gibson was outed by the JFK record dumps in 2012 as having been a prolific spy for the agency. So when you look into the founding of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, they were founded in April of 1960 as a pro-Cuban, pro-Castro organization, because the CIA was trying to pull Castro into our sphere of influence, right? But he didn't become a communist until December of 61. Right, so you got like 18 months where they're supporting him as not as a communist, but as a freedom fighter, right? That's what the Fair Play for Cuba Committee was doing. But what does he do when he becomes a communist? He betrays everyone. He should have been, on paper at least, betraying the Fair Play for Cuba Committee also. But what do they do at that point? Instead of saying, "Oh, he betrayed us," they just switch and start supporting him as a communist. Are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. This is COINTELPRO all day long. This is them trying to recruit other people in America to keep tabs on communists. That's what it was. And when you dig deeper into Lee Harvey Oswald, you'll find he had zero connection to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and that he basically was a patsy for Kerry Thornley, who had done all the writing and all the contacting of Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the printing of the flyers at Jones Printing. All that was done by Kerry Thornley and handed off to Lee Harvey Oswald to go hand out on the street corner, right? So, and that leads us up to the incident on the street with Carlos Bernier when he's arrested for handing out the flyers and all this stuff on the 9th. You have another incident very similar to that, where he's handing out flyers and he ends up on WDSU talking to John Corporon, New Orleans, right? So he's all over the television saying how he's a Marxist-Leninist, and then he has the debate with Carlos Bernier. Like, all this stuff was set up. And when you go
William
into like
Godet is the guy's name. Nobody knows his name.
Right.
He was a spook too, right?
Yeah, when you go into
responsible getting on TV.
Correct. When you get into William Godet, you'll find that William Godet is most certainly a longtime CIA employee. He was in charge of Latin American operations in as far as propaganda. He ran the Latin American Report, which was basically a CIA magazine that was used to spread propaganda in South America. But he happened to get his visa to travel to Mexico City on the same day, September 17th, that Oswald allegedly got his visa to travel to Mexico City. Another guy named David Pierce Magyar, also a friend of David Ferry, he got his permit or his visa to travel to Mexico City on September 17th. So you got three guys allegedly, well, all working with the CIA, right? Allegedly getting their visa on the same day. But as it turns out, Godet not only got his visa on the same day as Oswald, but he was directly responsible for the chain of events that got Oswald onto television on WDSU, right? So Godet has actually been interviewed in the past. He's actually been in some documentaries from like 30, 40 years ago. But his name has really kind of been overlooked as one of the key handlers. I would consider him like a handler of sorts. He is way above the operation kind of, and he probably had contact directly with Clay Shaw and these guys, but he clearly was keeping an eye on Oswald as he was on the street corner every time he was out there, as per his own words. So he was most certainly an observer, and probably he most certainly knew all of the Cubans, being that he was in charge of Latin American operations, right? He knew all the Cubans who were in New Orleans. He knew Sergi Arcacha, and he knew all these guys, Carlos Quiroga, and all those guys who were hanging around with David Ferry. So to be that involved and know everybody and be a key mover in some of the activities, but then to deny participation in the larger framework of the assassination, to me is ridiculous. Not that everybody who was involved knew what they were involved with, A lot of the lower level guys doing things did things that I'm sure they didn't know were connected to an assassination. Like when Frank Sheeran dropped off the rifles to David Ferry up in Baltimore, he probably had no idea at the time what he was doing. But we find out later on, he realized that those were the rifles that were probably used in Dealey Plaza. So,
right. And Ferry's a very important character. So the way the movie is portrayed is that he's some kind of low level guy who's got a thing and then gets murdered or whatever, some kind of strange
Yeah.
character, but he is really connected with everybody.
Connected
Shaw,
with everybody. And the thing about
mob,
David Ferry
CIA.
the thing that David Ferry got me, it really kind of stuck out was like that he, after the assassination, so many people got rewarded. Jack Valenti rewarded, so many people got rewarded and they moved up a career path. Not David Ferry. David Ferry seems to have, his participation seems to have been purely blackmail related. When you talk to his roommates after the assassination and guys like Jules Rico Kimball or guys like Raymond Brochiers.
Brochiers, yeah.
Yeah, like they're like, this guy was constantly busy doing stuff for the agency and he never had a dime in his pocket. So he was clearly being blackmailed. In the David Ferry files, they talk about how they had film of him having sex with an underage black girl. And so that was most certainly one of probably many things that were being held over his head. He was most certainly a child molester. He got tied up in a case with a guy named Al Landry that he had basically been molesting. He had been molesting all those kids. He used hypnosis basically to get these kids naked, and he would do things to them. And for some reason, they all continued to hang out with him, like some sort of weird, like Stockholm syndrome. So really
it's
strange.
Weird too. Like that Landry guy was around him all the time. That's weird.
All the time.
And the
yeah.
mind control is weird too. The aspect of it too.
Yes, I think
Ferry knew this stuff.
Yeah, that aspect of the assassination gets blown out of proportion a lot. A lot of people like to talk about like MK Ultra. It was Oswald and MK Ultra and all that. And I think that's like way out there, totally wrong. But there is hypnotism that pops up throughout the assassination on a couple of different fronts. So yeah, it's interesting.
What are the other fronts other than Ferry?
So you have Bill DeMar, who was a he was a hypnotist that worked for Jack Ruby. And allegedly his hypnosis was somehow involved with his blackmailing of Dallas cops. Because he would have like a stage show and he would hypnotize people on stage and get them to do stuff. And but then you have a doctor, I believe down in New Orleans, named Rivera, who Hank Albarelli wrote about this in his book High Strangeness and the Kennedy assassination. And he talks about this guy Rivera and some people he interacted with. And he might have actually been in the operating room at Bethesda when they did the autopsy. How he was dropping LSD in people and hypnotizing them with a ring that he wore. And like, so yeah, it pops up on a couple different fronts. If you haven't read anything by Hank Albarelli, he is amazing. His ability to pull up some data is just incredible. He was never able to really put together the dots that he dug up, but he did an amazing job, especially in his latest book, Coup in Dallas. Unfortunately, Hank's dead. He died a year or two ago, but Coup in Dallas is a phenomenal book. It's one of the handful of books that's like should be mandatory reading in the Kennedy assassination. He talks about this stuff in depth.
It's good work. And you even mentioned Jack Martin was like committed in the hospital for LSD. So this stuff is around. I mean,
yeah. Jack Martin's a guy. He's a weird one because the name Jack Martin was clearly being used by multiple people. So Edward Suggs was not the only Jack Martin in New Orleans. That Jack Martin in New Orleans was also undoubtedly Jean-Pierre Lafitte at some point. Jean-Pierre Lafitte he's another mystery. He's an amazing CIA big shot. He was one of two people who used the alias QJ Wynn, the other being Otto Skorzeny. But he had a personal relationship with James Angleton, dropped acid with James Angleton. But he most certainly, when you read some things about Jack Martin in New Orleans, you come to find out that Edward Suggs was a doctor who kind of had been wanted for doing backroom abortions. He was an alcoholic. He was a scumbag. And he didn't really have any tactical training at all. But when you talk to, there are some interviews of Jack Martin that appear in the literature where he's talking about all kinds of tactical stuff that he would never know because he didn't have that background. So the suspicion by Hank Albarelli was that was Jean-Pierre Lafitte, and that we should do some much more research into who Jack Martin actually was.
Right. So, God, it's just such a strange thing. And Ferry was always flying around picking stuff up and worked for Marcello. Like he was on a paid monthly stipend, right? Yeah,
he was working for G. Ray Gill. G. Ray Gill was Carlos Marcello's attorney, but come on, he was working for Carlos Marcello via G. Ray Gill. He had to have that little bit of plausible deniability, I guess. But yeah, Ferry. So Ferry allegedly was in G. Ray Gill's office at noon on November 22nd, as per Alice Guidros, who is G. Ray Gill's assistant or secretary. But she's totally lied, right? So everybody who provided an alibi for David Ferry lied. Like, they were all dirt. Like, you can't trust anybody who's associated with Carlos Marcello, including FBI agent Regis Kennedy, right, who was supposed to be like the Cuban contact for the FBI there. So he was involved in all this stuff too. I'll probably get to him in a future book. But yeah, you can't trust any of the people who provided an alibi for David Ferry. They're all working for the mob. They all lie. And David Ferry was provably in Dallas once you put together the string of events that I go over, from the descriptions behind the grassy knoll, connecting it all through the Tippit shooting. And all that is outlined in the book between chapters like 6 and 10. That's basically that chunk of time between 12:30 when the assassination starts and what happens after the Tippit shooting and the at the Texas Theater, which is some fascinating stuff. I love the stories of the Texas Theater, and Tippit is really fascinating how they did that. And really the identities of the shooters in the Tippit, they become obvious. You can't, when you study other things, right? This is one big problem I have with a lot of Kennedy researchers. Like, you can't just study one thing and expect to understand that thing. There's a lot of things on the outside that support it, right? And the Tippit shooting is like no different. And you really, when you come to understand the relationships in New Orleans, especially between David Ferry and Kerry Thornley in particular, and Sergio Arcacha, it really becomes obvious of who was involved in the Tippit shooting, and then the series of events afterwards on the Houston trip, like the Winterland trip to the ice skating rink, particularly the phone calls made to radio stations WDSU and WSHO, those conclusively, to me at least, link Kerry Thornley to the phone calls that were made from the Alamo Motel. So really, when you understand the relationships and you start to see this like mesh network, and then you look at certain phone calls that were made from certain places at certain times, it becomes obvious who was where and who was calling who and why. So
right, no, everybody's getting their alibi together, right? So
yep,
everybody, George Bush Sr. I wasn't there. I was 10 miles away, but I wasn't there. I wasn't actually in Dallas. Damn it! These funny statements.
I'm convinced he was in Dealey Plaza, but at the time, George Bush was a money guy. He was in the position he was in with intelligence, not because he was like some super spy, but because he had money, right? And the oil people, and him and his father had, deep connections with intelligence at the time back, probably prior to World War II. So, yeah. And then
he's a WASP, like elite Brahmin from the East Coast. I think that he was probably groomed for his job as the head of the CIA and presidency from the beginning.
I would think so. That makes a lot of sense. And then when you look at things like the fact that Jack Valenti worked for these guys at Humble Oil when he was 15 years old.
Wow.
You talk about being groomed.
Yeah, incredible. Like, he was in there from the very beginning. It's really incredible.
Yeah, and he lasted there.
And he's gay too. Like, it's just so strange. Like, these guys are all gay too. Like Shaw and Ferry. I don't know what Ferry is.
Here's another thing about Ferry that I discovered along the way is that, and he was, according to his taxes in 1949, he had 2 dependents and was said to have been married. And so I never was able to locate the identity of any wife, but I sure was able to identify a David Ferry Jr., who was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps in 1963, which is in the primary David Ferry file that everyone has had for 20 years. So the idea that David Ferry having a son has never been talked about is crazy to me, because it's right there in the pages of the David Ferry file. So,
and there's a lot about Ferry. I didn't know that he was the one who flew to pick up Marcello when RFK kicked him out of the country.
Yeah.
That also is another kind of important point of this anger towards the Kennedy brothers. Is like this kind of humiliating a mob boss. Like, where did he send him to? Honduras or something like that?
Yeah, Guatemala. It was so funny because that whole thing with Guatemala, like, they had actually paid somebody in Guatemala to like come up with like a fake birth certificate for Carlos Marcello, because he was not from Guatemala, right?
Right. I think he was a naturalized citizen of Italy. I mean, still an Italian citizen or something.
Right. Yeah. And so I don't remember why they even had to do that. I'll have to go back and check that. But like, then Robert Kennedy was like, "Oh yeah, you're from Guatemala? Great. Well, you can go back there." And they sent him off like a big screw you, which really is kind of hilarious in hindsight, but that they would do that to him. But yeah, David Ferry went and scoops him up and brings him back, and it seems like all that immigration stuff for Carlos Marcello went away after that.
Yeah, no, it's such a strange, it's such a remarkable story, and a lot of people don't know. Like you even write in your book, Carrie, you would have started at Carrie Thornley,
Hmm.
who's just a remarkable character too. Like his
Yeah.
arc. I mean, tell more about him. It's just
So
really
Kerry Thornley's a weird
fascinating.
guy. So he allegedly joins the Marines back in like 1956 or 57, but he doesn't actually get sent off to boot camp until like 58 or 59. And it's in 59 that he is paired with Oswald, Marine Air Squadron number 9, if I'm not mistaken, and it's at Santa Ana, California. So this is at a time when Oswald had already been to Atsugi, Japan, and comes back. After that, he meets Kerry Thornley. Kerry Thornley then gets sent to be in Oswald's unit in Atsugi when Oswald is back in the States. So
Yes.
we have some really interesting stuff that goes on with Kerry Thornley because obviously he's intelligence at this point. By 59, he's in the Marines. By the time he hits boot camp, I'm convinced that both Oswald and Kerry Thornley are both recruited by intelligence before they're even in the fucking Marines. That's why they went to the Marines. They were sent to the Marines as part of their intelligence training. So it turns out that in October of 1960, you have Kerry Thornley in Atsugi, Japan, and he's going by an alias of Rick Thornley. Why he's using an alias, I don't know, but he's using the alias of Rick Thornley, and he's claiming to be a photographer. And he meets a guy named Ronald Schwinghammer, who is also a Marine out there. And Schwinghammer talks to Garrison or the FBI or whomever he talks to after, and basically says that he met Rick Thornley, and Rick Thornley was writing a book called The Idle Warriors, and it was a book about the Marine Squadron and Lee Harvey Oswald. However, when they ask Kerry Thornley about when he finds out about Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union, he claims that he didn't find out about it till he was on a train back from Atsugi, right? He was on a train somewhere coming home after October of 1960. So he lies about when he finds out about Oswald. He lies about doing research on Oswald in Atsugi to Jim Garrison. Then when he comes back, he ends up in New Orleans in January of 61 or February of 61. February of 61 is an interesting time frame for him to pick because literally just a week or two prior to his alleged arrival in New Orleans, we have an incident at the Bolton Ford dealership in New Orleans involving clearly Lawrence Howard and another man who was impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald because they attempt to buy a bunch of Jeeps for the Friends of Democratic Cuba, based out of 544 Camp Street, which is Bannister's building. And he is trying to get Jeeps, quote for Jeeps, to send down there to help the revolution. Right. So he gives the name of Lee Oswald, and Lawrence Howard, who was a heavyset Mexican with a pockmarked face. He had bumps all over his face like he had moles. Very clear cut that this man is seen all over the place with Oswald for a 2-year period leading up to the assassination. I'll get to that in a second. But this incident in 1961 coincides kind of when Kerry Thornley gets to New Orleans and the setup of Lee Harvey Oswald really begins. Because between January of 61 and the assassination, there are literally hundreds of incidents where Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly interacted with people and that he left an impression on them, whether he was talking about guns or talking about communism or talking about having a Russian wife or having lived in the Soviet Union. Between January of 61 and November of 63, which is almost, 3 years, right? It's 2.5 years, a long-ass time. This setup involving two men, Kerry Thornley and William Seymour. And for those 2 years, they were going all over the country impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald, leaving this false trail to Oswald. Whether it was talking about, like I said, talking about guns or communism, they went out of their way to do things and to say things to draw attention to themselves. So that once Oswald was seen on television, 100+ people got a hold of the FBI saying, hey, I interacted with this guy in the weeks leading up to the assassination, and it was never Oswald. Not once. I've gone through every single incident with Lee Harvey Oswald, and none of them were Oswald. All of them were either, and I base this depending on who they were with or descriptions and character and were they abrasive or not? Because Oswald was a very nice guy. He was never abrasive. He was never confrontational. But Kerry Thornley would go places and be an outright dick all the time. right? And people would say it was Oswald. And oftentimes he was lazy. He didn't shave every day. Oswald did. So Kerry Thornley would go somewhere. He'd have 3-4 days of stubble on his face. You'll never see a picture of Oswald with 3 or 4 days of stubble. Ever. Doesn't exist because the guy was so clean cut and neat and tidy all the time. So I began to use these descriptors and various things to separate these Oswald sightings. And then the other set of Oswald sightings was clearly William Seymour, like at the rifle range. And we know this because he was always seen with a large, husky Latino, often described as having a pockmarked face. And that man is Lawrence Howard. He's the only man in the entire assassination story that matches these descriptions. Large, a heavy set, dark complexion, big feet, long hair, very hairy. Like, you put together all these different descriptions from different people, you got a clear-cut picture of Lawrence Howard. So, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so Thornley is in the strangest places. He's writing about Oswald like he's important. And it's just so bizarre. And he is, people who think they're seeing Oswald are seeing Thornley. That's really what it is.
Yeah.
So Russo, who's played by Kevin Bacon, there's a famous scene in JFK where they're like,
Willie O'Keefe,
talking. Right. He thinks he's seeing Oswald. It's not Oswald. It's Thornley.
No. And I go into great detail in that scene, in that situation with where he thinks that he sees Oswald at this party in New Orleans in September. Now, I think it was determined the party was September 25th, if I'm not mistaken. So they're at this party in New Orleans, and allegedly he sees Lee Harvey Oswald. And there's a bunch of Cubans there, and the Cubans are all like having fun and drinking beer and this and that. And then everybody clears out, and then it's left with Clem Bertrand, who's Clay Shaw. It's left with Leon Oswald, who was Kerry Thornley, and David Ferry, and Perry Russo. And the three of them, why they decided to openly talk about this stuff in front of Perry Russo, I really don't know. I call it hubris or whatever. But they start talking about rifle trajectories and having crossfire and who to frame for and all this stuff. But the description that he gives of Oswald is that Oswald had a couple days worth of stubble on his face, right? So at this point, it was clearly, to me, Kerry Thornley. However, the further I dug into this, the more then I came to realize that Perry Russo had actually been to David Ferry's house 3 or 4 times leading up to that party in September. He had met this other roommate all of those times, 3 or 4 times. And he said prior to the party that he had a big beard, like it was just a big, like a beatnik. He described him like a dirty beatnik. And of course, we have pictures of Kerry Thornley, the dirty beatnik, who was the roommate of Kerry. Right. Yeah. And so, beatnik. To me, it was pretty clear cut that was never Oswald in New Orleans there. It was Kerry Thornley. And every single incident that I ended up going through that people are convinced was Oswald, including his jobs that he held, never Oswald. Oswald's nowhere. He's a complete ghost. The only interactions that I believe were the Oswald who we believe is Lee Harvey Oswald was actually the ones with George de Mohrenschildt and the Paynes. And, Max Gold and a couple of the other people who were around the white Russian community who had interacted. Like, that was Oswald. Nothing else.
And you don't think he stayed at the boarding house?
No,
you don't
not
think
a chance.
All that's just is totally fake. Yeah.
Totally fake. Yeah, it was Kerry Thornley staying at the boarding houses. And so the one at 621 North Marsalis. Okay, the one at 621 North Marsalis ran by Mary Bledsoe, who actually also happens to be the witness to Lee Harvey Oswald being on the bus later, right? So she's allegedly his boarding house woman, right? So, but right, so no, clearly
providing some stories. So everybody has these alibis or BS stories in the JFK.
Right, right. So basically, with Kerry Thornley, he received the tip for me there was he received a phone call and. Mary Bledsoe is not supposed to know much about Oswald, but she seems to know that his wife is Russian and all this stuff. And then she slips up when she testifies to the Warren Commission deposition that the woman who called him spoke in Spanish. Oh, really? That's fascinating. Well, who on our cast of characters would be calling Kerry Thornley and speaking in Spanish? What woman? And now there's only one woman in the cast of characters connected directly to Jack Ruby who would be speaking Spanish to Kerry Thornley, and that's Candy Barr. So that kind of gave me the inkling that it was never Oswald staying there. Oswald only knew a couple words of Spanish, and we know that because of Nelson Delgado, who he was in the Marines with, right? So yeah, it was definitely not him there. And then when I really dug into the boarding house at 1026 North Beckley, that was the most obvious that it was never him. And then when I connected the dots on Tippett, it became obvious that the person who shot Tippett was the same person who was living at the boarding house. So that eliminated Oswald because Oswald, out of at the time that he was allegedly staying at the 1026 North Beckley boarding house, when you look at the dates that he was actually confirmed to have stayed in Fort Worth, that was like 75% of the dates. That only left like 3 or 4 days in the entire month that Oswald was alleged to have even stayed there at all. So obviously Oswald never stayed there. He was staying at the Payne's house the entire time. It was Kerry Thornley staying there, and who'd they say it was? It was O.H. Lee that was living there, right? But O.H. Lee, see, we have the receipts from a guy named Herbert Leon Lee who had been staying in room O at the boarding house starting October 1st through about mid-November, okay? So, I'm sorry, but the alias of O.H. Lee, but then we find out someone named Herbert Leon Lee in room O was staying there. That's way too big of a coincidence for me. That to me is them retroactively trying to fit documents that they had to the new story, right? Because the O.H. Lee alias didn't come out right away. It didn't come out for years like everything else in the story. It was never up front on the news or anything else on day one, to my knowledge. Therefore, it was just another rewriting of history involving Herbert Leon Lee, who admits that he was there. He was tracked down and lived in Shreveport. So, yeah, the entire story about the boarding house is completely bunk.
Right. There's just so many fictional mythological pieces to this whole thing. Oswald and the bus, like, oh, then he shot the president, then he ran back to the boarding house. Well, none of that's even relevant. It's just,
right, and see the level of shenanigans involved in this, as I call them, the level of crazy tradecraft and misdirection. That was the biggest thing that I was really worried about with this book. Because my take on this is so drastically different from every other take that's ever been. I was just scared that it's going to be not overwhelmingly accepted, despite the level of documentation I have. You know?
Yeah, and you emphasize just totally different characters than I've heard. Everybody talks about E. Howard Hunt is the shooter and all this other stuff. Like, I mean, you mentioned him, I think, in the Kerry Thornley section. He was Gary Kirstein.
Right. And I think that's even a rewriting of history too. I don't even think that Kerry Thornley believed that. I think once he came to understand the name of E. Howard Hunt, he inserted him into the story. So that's my take there.
And I mean, Kerry Thornley didn't stop even with the whole, the death of JFK. He went on to become a Discordian. Like, he was like one of the popes or the heads of this Discordian.
And the weird thing is, like, it turns out he started coming up with the Discordian stuff in the 50s. Like,
oh, wow.
He started writing some of that stuff way before this Kennedy assassination. Like, he was, I don't understand really. I kind of understand the CIA, but when it comes down to the nuts and bolts, I don't understand the CIA. What the hell are they doing with the Discordian movement? I mean, are they just trying to come up with weird counterculture movements for the sake of experimentation or to keep tabs on people or what? I don't know, but what the CIA was doing with these weird organizations in the 60s and then connecting them to like the hippie movement and the LSD and all that stuff is like, holy shit. These guys they created our entire counterculture. Right. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, who knows?
Right, it's incredible. Like, this guy is part of the counterculture of Robert Anton Wilson. All these other characters are involved in Discordianism.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really something else. Did Thornley have like a elite background? He's a Mormon, right? He was born in a Mormon thing.
Yeah, but I don't know how much of an influence that may have had on him. And a lot of people try to connect a lot of Mormon stuff to conspiracy stuff. And I'm like, I just don't understand it. So I don't really see if there's a connection there. But that might have had a thing. But one thing I don't get is, like, he enrolled in the Marines, but then he didn't go to the Marines for 2 years. And then when he was actually he was in for less than 2 years, just long enough to meet Oswald and do all that stuff and then go to New Orleans. Strange. Very strange.
Really strange. Just tons of pen names and just a weird, curious guy, heavily involved in the JFK assassination that few other people really mention. I mean, I don't think other people found him to be important, but it is important if they were just impersonating Oswald all the time, like all those stories. Like, Oswald was everywhere, in almost two places at once too, right?
So from what I can tell, the plot to kill Kennedy was formulated sometime around February or March of 1963. It had to have been because the shipments of the rifle and the handgun occurred in March. So the setup had to have occurred prior to that. However, they were setting Oswald up for something going back to 61, two plus years before, I believe, the plotting for the assassination started. So why would they be using Oswald's name to buy Jeeps in New Orleans? Why would they be setting him up as a communist at all while he's still in the Soviet Union. Why would they be doing any of this? The only thing I could rack my brain to think of, and I think the Mexico City trip allegedly, I think this kind of nails this, is I think they were trying to repurpose him to get into Cuba. I think that's what they were initially trying to do. And then when the assassination plot started to arise, they just shifted it to Oswald. Yeah, and why? That calls for too much speculation on my part. I'm not sure.
He seems to be part of like a long-term program.
Oh yeah,
of handlers, and it's unbelievable. Like he had an unbelievable life. Dead at 24. Like he's all over the place. At Sugi, Russia. I mean, all kinds of New York, then Fort Worth. I mean, it's his life.
And one thing I want to emphasize: I don't think we know him. I don't think we know Oswald at all. Like I don't think we know anything about Lee Harvey Oswald, what he thought about anything, what he felt about anything, because it seems he got into this plot as a child before he even had any say in the matter. Obviously, his parents had a say in the matter, right? So I don't believe any of the history.
Yeah,
I don't believe any of the history about his father or anything.
Right. Interesting, because his father, he didn't really have a father, right? And you mentioned in the book, like these guys were looking for fatherless figures, young men who were impressionable. They're easier to control. So I think he was part of a broader operation because there was some like either an attempt in Chicago on Kennedy that involved a character like Oswald, where he was like
Thomas Valley. That was the patsy in the Chicago plot. I haven't spent a lot of time on them. I've brushed over them, but that's where you get into like Abraham Bolden, the first black Secret Service agent who ends up busting the plot in Chicago, and then they go after him as like a fraud or a thief or something, and they ruined his career. Joe Biden actually recently pardoned him. I don't know if you know that. So he had been trying to get pardoned his whole life, and Joe Biden did it. So that was a good thing. But so the Chicago plot's wild. The Miami plot is wild, involving Manuel Artem and those guys down there in Miami. Really interesting stuff, but it's something that's so far down the list of my to-do list. I'll probably never get to it.
I just think that it's interesting in the context of Oswald. Like he probably wasn't one target. There's some file somewhere in the CIA where they had 5, 10, 15 younger men. They were curating or something, because even Oswald, even when he was at school in New York, like there was intel connections there, and there was weird doctors and stuff. Like it's just very strange, like his whole life. And the fact that he was with Ferry at 15, like it's just like his life. Like people are like, yeah, we got to do this for Oswald. We got to get Oswald at Atsugi. Atsugi's basically in like Japan. It's what's the main Tokyo? It's outside of Tokyo, if I remember.
Yeah, it was purely a CIA base. I mean, it was for the U-2 plane and all that stuff, which, based on what I've seen, in reference to David Ferry, I'm convinced David Ferry was a U-2 pilot, and that's why he lost all his hair. People try to say he had alopecia, but when you go through his file, there's talks about they interviewed his doctor. His doctor said he did not have alopecia. His doctor was trying to find some viral cause for it. But when you look into the early U-2 pilots, particularly the Chinese U-2 pilots, they had the same thing. Because of the ultra pressurization of the suits, they lost all their hair, could never grow it back. I'm inclined to lean in that direction with Ferry, because we have witnesses who put David Ferry with Clay Shaw at the airport in Venice, Florida in 1947. 2 years before David Ferry is alleged to have been married up in Tampa. So we know David Ferry was living down in Florida at that time, which means that if he was seen with Clay Shaw in 47, obviously these guys aren't out there on a picnic. They're obviously working down there for the CIA, which also kind of solidifies the idea that the Venice airport was run by the CIA still at the time when the 9/11 hijackers were using it back in like 2000 or 99, So, yeah, so these guys are lifelong CIA, lifelong. David Ferry was most certainly caught up in all this stuff. His military history is obscured because he's not alleged to have been in World War II or done anything like that. But there is some and he denies ever having been in the military. But there is records of him having been in military reserves for 4 years, which he never mentions to anybody, but it's in his record. So what does that mean? Whenever I see reserves, I think intelligence. Reserves is like enough to get, 2 weeks a year and 2 weekends a month. Like that's enough for anybody to get out of their routine to go do spook stuff. So,
right. No, it's incredible. Yeah. And then he died mysteriously too, right? Didn't they get poisoned or something like that? Yeah.
So David Ferry, his death was deemed natural causes. There were allegedly 2 suicide notes. I just don't know what to think of David Ferry's death. Timing is suspicious. He was afraid of getting killed, but then he kills himself. That doesn't really make any sense. But if they murdered him, they did it in a way that didn't leave a trace. Who knows? He was most certainly an inconvenient person, but he never would have folded to Garrison because he pulled the trigger. David Ferrie pulled the trigger. So, like, he's never going to give that up. Even when you look at the statements that he made to Raymond Brochiers when they were roommates, Brochiers says that David Ferrie would get all jacked up on alcohol or pills or whatever, and he would talk to him about the assassination. But everything that Ferrie told him about the assassination was a total lie. He was telling him about he was a getaway pilot and all this stuff. Total fiction, because David Ferrie drove out of Dallas in a light-colored Ford Falcon station wagon. He didn't fly out of nothing. So all the stories he gave to people in the years afterwards about his involvement as a pilot, totally made up. I feel that David Ferrie felt like he needed to vent to people, but he knew he couldn't tell them the truth, and hence you have statements from people like Jules Rigo Kimball and like Raymond Brochiers, who he told things to. Because that's a heavy burden. It's a heavy burden to have on you that you shot the president and you can't tell anybody,
Right, so he's your Grassy Knoll guy, right?
He's one of two. He fired the first shot and struck Kennedy in the throat. From there, he throws his rifle to Andrew Jerome Blackman, who was a seaman who came in the Galveston trip, who was allegedly going to meet up with Rose Jeremy to bring in the heroin and all that stuff. The Rose Jeremy story is a whole other tale. But Blackman takes the rifle, breaks it down, puts it in a toolbox. This is all seen by a guy named Ed Hoffman. This was all highlighted in The Men Who Killed Kennedy, the series that talked about the assassination. So
the guy who made the series and then disappeared.
Right.
He knows what happened. He went back to Europe and changed his name or something. He got a little too close to the truth, right? I mean,
but I had actually found a documentary from about the 80s. It was British, and it was not The Men Who Killed Kennedy. I can't remember what it's called, but they straight up named David Ferrie as a shooter on the Grassy Knoll. And at the time, I totally dismissed it. I'm like, whatever. And then it was right. It was completely correct. And I was able to basically put together the fact that David Ferrie was the first shooter on the Grassy Knoll based on descriptions of him behind the knoll, walking through the railroad yards, behind the railroad yards, sitting in a gray car, and then again with the gray car at the tippet shooting. So I was able to, through matching descriptions, place David Ferrie at the scene of the Grassy Knoll behind the picket fence, and then behind the book depository, and then again at the tippet shooting where he's seen by 3 witnesses. So, and the descriptions they give, no one ever says David Ferrie, but of course the descriptions they give are a perfect match of David Ferrie, including the real heavy eyebrows and all, because he painted them on. So
that's so strange. What a strange story, the JFK.
Oh yes,
story. Still resonating today. They're not giving away files, and
let me talk about that for a minute. Yeah. So there's in going over the list of files that they're holding on to, I have only found 3 that I believe have any significance whatsoever, and none of them have to do with the assassination. The files that they're holding on to are in reference to, number 1, David Morales. That's probably the biggest one that they're holding on to. That will show that David Morales was in Dallas that weekend. Then you have files on 2 guys, Harry Hall or Harry Haller, depending on who you ask. One of them's an alias. He was a CIA/mob guy who was connected to Jack Valenti and involved in some sort of stolen letterhead from the White House that had Jack Valenti's name on it. Real interesting story, but I believe Jack Valenti was trying to make a side buck while he was in the White House, and one of his co-conspirators got busted, Harry Haller. Those documents are all being withheld. And then you have documents on a guy named Charles the Blade Torreen. Charles Torreen was a mob hitman, and turns out he was an associate of Valenti. And so I believe those are the 3 names that they're hiding in the assassination files. None of them have anything to do with the assassination. All of them are going to show relationships with Valenti, and that's pretty much it.
And Morales was kind of like a underground tough guy, hung out with Sturgis, right?
Yeah, he was a big shot in the CIA, and especially after killing Kennedy.
His son is still around. I mean, his family's around. And I think he died under suspicious circumstances. He went to D.C., came back and had a heart attack or something strange.
Yeah, I've never actually looked into the David Morales at the end because I know that him, like a lot of the other CIA guys, like William Harvey, ended a life in poverty and like in alcoholism and squander and like not good, right? So
yeah, bitter too, like
real bitter.
People.
Yeah, like he was a horrible guy. Like, I mean, from his perspective, he was a patriot and he would do whatever it took to save America and this and that, right? But hey, He thought saving America meant killing Kennedy. So, I mean, these
Right.
guys, despite their own personal motivations of patriotism, it's not always guided correctly.
Yeah, no. I mean, and the killing of Kennedy just set off ferocious war in Southeast Asia. Millions of people died there. Like they always talk about, like we lost 50,000 people, which is terrible, and lost a lot of people to madness and drugs. But they ravaged that whole, part of the world. Just
Yeah.
nightmare, hellscape stuff. Bombings, and they were going to nuke. They were going to nuke. Johnson was thinking about nuking Vietnam. It's off the charts.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But, it set off crazy. I think Kennedy was really trying to keep all that stuff.
Yeah, I don't think
Pandora's box closed. Yeah,
I think you're 100% correct. I think that the world we're living in today is a direct result of the killing of Kennedy. Like, I can draw a straight line from November 22nd to all these bullshit social movements they're pushing on us today, aka cultural Marxism. It's all because they got rid of Kennedy. Kennedy was going to put an end to this before it even got off the ground. That's why they killed him.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So
it's really crazy, and it led to 9/11. All that stuff. Like
all that stuff. Well, I see these as
Charlie Robinson. Yeah.
To me, these are all one operation. Like, there's no separating Kennedy from 9/11 from COVID-19. This is one operation, all with the same mission.
Good point, yeah.
And it's the undermining of American culture. That's what it's all about. It's the destruction of America. That's what Kennedy and everything since has been about.
Interesting. And we've barely covered the book. You've done such great research. There's other chapters. You go through the assassination, what's going on at the book depository, the escape from Dealey Plaza, explain who the three tramps are. So,
yeah,
and all that stuff. So,
there's a lot to it. I tried to answer all the big questions, all the major questions. Who are the three tramps? Who was Oswald? Like, who pulled the triggers? Those are the stuff that I tried to get across. And I really didn't try to make Oswald a focus of the book. Really, I tried to make everybody else a focus of the book. However, I couldn't, because the impersonation and the setup of Oswald was so intricately linked to the shooters that it was hard to separate. So therefore, going through all the Kerry Thornley stuff, and then once you get into Kerry Thornley, that leads right to Tippit, right? So everything was connected and all led back to each other. So that's why I ended up covering the subjects that I did. But honestly, it's weird. I wrote almost 400 pages and I didn't even talk about the mob at all. Right? I could write a whole book just on the mob involvement. That aspect is crazy. I didn't even talk about that at all. And then there's the Israelis, and I didn't even touch on them whatsoever. That's going to be like
the Israel Jewish interests are surrounding this.
They were behind the assassination 100% start to finish. But that's going to take a whole book to explain. That's going to be years from now, unfortunately.
Permindex and the elites, like they had to.
The biggest thing was the relationship between the Israelis and the LA mob. When you come to understand the relationship between the LA mob and the Israelis, you're like, this is one organization. They are not separate. There is no separating the Mossad and the mob in 1963. They are one organization in lockstep with all their decisions and everything. Because the mob was run by Meyer Lansky, and Meyer Lansky was a diehard Zionist. I mean, if it wasn't for Meyer Lansky, there would not be a state of Israel today. That's almost fact.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah, the mob, if it wasn't for the mob and the relationship with the pre-Israeli Zionists, I call them, like Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann and Menachem Begin and Shamir and all these guys, if it wasn't for the relationship with Meyer Lansky, there might not be in Israel today. There's a great article called Gangsters of Zion. I forget who wrote it, but Gangsters for Zion. And that talks about the relationship that started in 46 with between Reuven Daphne and the LA mob, and shows how the relationship built up leading to in 48. And if it wasn't for the large scale weapons smuggling and money laundering that was being done by Meyer Lansky, the Israelis never would have had the money to do what they did. So, yeah, it's crazy
They were up
stuff.
against a lot of forces. Basically the whole Arab world wanted to get rid of Israel. Cory, we're at the hour mark. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed? And where can people find the book?
So you can get the book at all the online major retailers, but it really does me a big service if you buy it from buymeacoffee.com/JFK book. There you can also buy a couple other things. You can get my book. You can get access to my private research chat. I have limited edition posters coming of the book cover, and also you can buy my notes. That's the biggest thing. You can buy a copy of my notes with a copy of the book, and it's got like all the documents, all the pictures, all the stuff that is in the book. You can see the actual documents that support it. So
yeah, the pictures you showed me last time I'd never seen before. You said it was buymeacoffee.com/JFK
book. Yeah.
Gotcha. So that's the best place to buy it.
Or if you go to coryhughes.org, all the links are there too.
Okay, and so you can be found. Is that the best place to reach you if people want to follow up with you?
Oh yeah, and you can contact me through there also.
Gotcha. And I'll put a link to your book, Buy Me a Coffee, and your website in the show notes so people can just click through. But
Great.
Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for the book. I mean, it's super timely to get it out there right now, and I wish you all success. And
I appreciate that. I really do. Thank you for having me on.
All right, Cory, take care. Stay there. Stay there.